Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 2 of Fireside Chats with Erin. I'm your host, Erin Gowerluck. As the Executive Director of the Grain Growers of Canada, I started this podcast to serve as a forum for real conversations with industry influencers and policymakers. For grain grower members across the country, harvest is either underway or just around the corner. And for those of us here in the nation's capital, things are a little quieter since Parliament rose for the summer. So we thought this would be an opportune time to sit back and take stock as we begin preparations for what is likely to be another busy fall season. So today's episode is intended to serve as a state of the nation as far as federal agriculture policy is concerned, and there is no better person to deliver that message than Deputy Minister Chris Forbes. Chris Forbes was appointed Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in May of 2017. But prior to joining AAFC, Chris was Associate Deputy Minister of Finance Canada from November 2016 to May 2017, and the Associate Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada from 2015 to 2016. Chris was also an Assistant Deputy Minister at Environment Canada from 2013 to 2015 and worked at the Department of Finance for a decade in the areas of tax policy, social policy, and federal-provincial relations. Before joining the federal government, Chris worked for the government of the Northwest Territories and the Toronto Dominion Bank. He holds a master's in economics from McGill University. Deputy Forbes, thank you for stopping by for a fireside chat.
Well, thanks for having me, Erin. I'm looking forward to it.
We're moving away, I think, increasingly. I'm spending less time at the fireside now. We started this podcast when we were under lockdown, and I spent a lot of time by the fireside. And now here we are back in our respective offices again. Is that the case for you too?
I am. I'm back in the office pretty much every day of the week, and getting back to a little more normal in terms of engagement with colleagues and stakeholders and partners across government.
Great. That's what we're hopeful for this fall as well, that we can all be back together in person again. And so that's why I thought maybe with that on the horizon that we would use today's conversation as an opportunity to kind of survey the landscape, if you will, reflect on the year that has passed and think about what the sector's priorities will be for this fall. I know you are someone who stakeholders meet with on a regular basis. Many of our listeners have had the opportunity certainly to interact with you over the last year. So I'd like to know, when you think about the conversations that you've had with stakeholders over the last year, what are the 2 or 3 issues that have largely dominated those interactions?
Yeah, when I go back, Erin, I mean, thanks for the question. I think when I think about the last, even if I go back a couple of years, obviously it's been a really tough few years. I mean, you talked, obviously, touched on the impact of the pandemic in terms of our in-person presence, but obviously it's gone beyond that in terms of, all the supply chain and other challenges that kind of arose during the pandemic. Throw on top of that the serious drought last year in Western Canada. It's been a pretty tough couple of years, I would say, and the sector has been amazing in terms of the resilience collectively and individually that we've seen from the sector. So lots of issues that have been discussed. If I think about 2 or 3, I'd maybe start to say, I think one, when I'm talking to, and I think colleagues in the department are talking to stakeholders, and we do hear, I think quite regularly, concerns about what I would, lump together as a series of kind of very specific regulatory issues and market access issues will usually come up in discussions with stakeholders. And those, the regulatory issues are surely known to your listeners, ranging from pest management issues to new plant breeding techniques, labeling issues. I mean, the host of regulatory issues for stakeholders and market access issues. Obviously, with countries like China, we've had significant challenges over the past few years. So that bucket, I would say, is something that comes up in different ways with every set of stakeholders. The supply chain issues and those of what predated the Russian illegal invasion of the Ukraine, but obviously were exacerbated by that. And so discussions around supply chain, costs of inputs, food security, I'm sure we'll talk more about those things. Those come up a lot with stakeholders. And then I would say probably climate change and the associated issues. And there I would just say, I mean, some of it is in response to the government's agenda, people coming in with questions, sharing their perspectives. Some of it's about the real impacts of climate change. As I said, the drought and flood experience last year in Western Canada and then in BC in December. And we'll talk about this for sure, but obviously in the more recent term, we've had lots of engagement on the fertilizer targets in specific. So yeah, a healthy dialogue on a wide range of issues. Tough to come up with really two or three.
Well, that's part of what I love about working in this industry is there is really so much going on. There never is a dull moment, and I expect that it's going to be some very interesting conversations this fall. While you continue to reflect on the past year, I know it's not your role to be critical of the government, but I'd like to get some of your feedback based again on the conversations that you've had with stakeholders, thinking about the policies, programs, and announcements that have been made more recently. Where did the government get it right, in your view, based on some of the feedback that you received? And where do we have more work to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, look, I think always, a little self-assessment is always good. And if I think about the, agriculture and agri-food Canada and where we've got things right, where I feel really proud of what we've done, I mean, I'd say a few things. One would be, I think we did manage through the pandemic reasonably well, both in terms of continuing to launch new programs to deal with some of the issues that came up. We've made some permanent adjustments to programs, new programs that were launched. And I feel that those have gone relatively well in terms of our engagement with stakeholders. And, I would include the big agri recovery, BRM response, agri insurance, agri recovery to the drought and floods last year as a real, I think, success of the department working with provincial partners and with stakeholders to kind of work through a very difficult period. Obviously, 3 weeks ago in Saskatoon, we came to, I think, a really important success from my end, which is the announcement of an agreement by federal, provincial, and territorial ministers on a next agricultural policy framework, the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. I think new dollars, which will be very helpful, I think, for a range of priorities, economic and environmental priorities. But also, I think just the timing, quite honestly, as an official for best ensuring we can, deliver in as seamless a way as possible across agreements. So I think that to me was a big success. I think about things we can do better. For me, or you'd ask things where we've fallen down. I mean, I think for me as a deputy minister, it's are we, have we engaged, heard the stakeholders' concerns? Have we communicated in two ways, right, effectively? And I think there's always more we can do in terms of both listening to the concerns of producers, but also sharing perspectives on what we're trying to achieve. And as the agriculture deputy, it's really important for me working inside for me and colleagues in the department to have a good understanding of producer perspectives, because we are engaging with departments, regulatory departments, colleagues at CFIA, Health Canada, Environment Canada. Really important for us to have a good sense of where producers' needs are at, their situations. And so I always feel, and COVID and this virtual environment that we've, this now hybrid, I guess, environment that we're working through, has, I think, probably challenged us in terms of capacity to engage and listen. And I think that's somewhere where I think we can really do more, particularly with some of the big files coming up, and we'll talk more about those. But that to me is that's an area where we need to just keep working.
Thanks for that. And I would agree. We've had similar conversations with our organization internally. And I think that was largely the conversation from which our road to 2050, the sector's commitment to be net zero by 2050, was born from one of those conversations in terms of how are we as a sector going to be better positioned to interface with the government and bring solutions to the conversation. What is the producer perspective on this issue? What do you want to see in this space? We've got work to do.
Yeah, and I think, Erin, it's a really great point you make about the road to 2050, because I think, and we'll talk about this in the context of fertilizers too. Like we need to listen, right? We need to be able to listen, and we need to be able to engage. And there's going to be tough conversations, but we all have to, if I dictate or try to dictate everything, that's not going to be a successful outcome. I need to be able to back and forth have discussions with organizations like grain growers, right, about what's the best way to get where we collectively want to go. And I think we've got a lot of great opportunities in the agriculture and food space, and so working together is how we're going to get there.
Excellent. So let's go back for a moment to the FPT meeting that took place a few weeks ago now, back in Saskatoon. The federal, provincial, and territorial agriculture ministers met for their annual conversation, and you referenced business risk management programs. That makes up the largest funding portion of the framework, and the ministers met to discuss, and I think in keeping with Minister Bibeau's mandate letter, which was to, and I quote, integrate climate risk management, environmental practices, and climate readiness into those programs. Minister Bibeau, along with her counterparts, agreed to attach some form of cross-compliance, we're calling it that, cross-compliance with Agri Invest and Agri Stability in particular. So I wondered if you could tell our listeners a bit more about what that's supposed to look like.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Erin. And yeah, the BRM conversation is obviously really important. When I was doing my list of top 3 issues, I certainly could have put BRM on that list, because it's obviously been it's a going concern for producers every year, right? How we can make that program better and more effective for producers. So, we did get an agreement, as I said, on the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership. On BRM, there were a number of agreements, and maybe I'll just walk through those a little bit and finish on the climate linkages there. But we did agree to increase the agri stability compensation rate, federal government, provinces, and territories from 70% to 80%. Also agreed, and I think this is something that will hopefully bear some really good fruit, if that's the right way to put it, for agri-stability, in terms of working on a new agri-stability model that we think will be faster, simpler, and more predictable for producers. And this has been an ongoing issue where it's not solved. I think we have to do some further engagement with stakeholders, but I feel like that's got a lot of potential, and I think will answer a lot of concerns if we can get this right and work with producers to get an improved agri-stability model that will get at some of the concerns we've heard repeatedly. There was no cross-compliance, as you said, related to agri-stability in the discussions that came out. So just to be clear on that, that part. On the go forward, we did agree, to work together on ways to integrate climate risks and readiness into BRM programs, and to consult with industry. And we'd like to do that over the next year. And I'm sure that Erin, your organization and others will be engaged on that. And really here, we're, as you say, following on the minister's mandate letter. We are certainly wanting to make sure that while we do any of this work, we are not hampering the effectiveness of the BRM suite, right? I want to make that point. I think that's been pretty clearly told to us by our minister and by provincial and territorial ministers. So we're looking at incentives. How can producers who adopt, incent producers to adopt environmental practices that can reduce production risks and help better protect them against climate risk? So that's the kind of stuff we will be looking at. We did announce, and we'll work with provinces and stakeholders to bring this into effect, and a change to Agri Invest that will require agri environmental risk assessment for farms with allowable net sales over $1 million. And so this is really about just making sure the largest farms have plans and work in place to assess some of the risks they'll face from climate, right? And I think that my expectation is this is actually reflecting the reality on the ground, that this is what folks are doing. They see it every day, every year, right? The changing climate and the risks that's bringing. So I expect that change, I think that change is relatively straightforward from my standpoint.
Thanks. And maybe just to unpack that piece a little further with respect to agri-stability, because some of the feedback that we're getting from our members across the country is a lack of clarity, or perhaps they're a little unsure about what other forms of cross-compliance may be in place with the balance of the suite. So I think we're clear on what the expectations are around Agri Invest. What can they expect around other programs going forward?
I think this is where the discussion will come. And again, if I we will engage with producers. So this isn't going to be a black box exercise. And really it is about, does the suite, really ensure that, we are making the correct linkages, if you will, between climate risks and production risks, and taking into account those who are activities or practices that are reducing those climate risks. So whether that's via programs like Agri insurance, how that will play out, I mean, that's what the discussion will be about over the next year, where we'll work with our provincial colleagues in particular, but also again with stakeholders, with producers, to understand what their concerns and also where they see opportunities, right? So I think that's the goal of the work over the next year. So nothing more than what's already, I have to be quite direct, no agenda there other than to engage and try to meet the mandate commitment that the minister, as you pointed out in your question, has been given by the Prime Minister.
And so these consultations or conversations with respect to cross compliance, are they going to happen as part of the conversations that the government has committed to having over the next year in terms of how we're going to make programs like agri-stability more, more efficient? Are those conversations going to be one and the same?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I'm not sure I've got that all mapped out for you right now. I think the point there would be, I think it's hard to completely delink them, obviously, right? Because they're talking potentially about same programs. The agri-stability discussion is really more about agri-stability itself, whereas the engagement on BRM is, what is broader, right? So it would include the suite. So I think they're related but different discussions. So I'm cognizant of, at the same time, consultation fatigue, right? Like there's only so much engagement we can do. So we have to be careful and pick the most effective ways to engage with organizations and individuals, right?
And that's fair. I respect that. I'm just cognizant too of the fact that I think we have a shared goal of seeing more farmers enrolled in programs like agri-stability.
Yeah, for sure.
What impact, great that we're going to look at ways to make the program more efficient so that we can increase enrollment. But what impact are some of these environmental, the cross compliance? What impact could that have potentially on enrollment rates? Because we want to see them go up, not down.
And I would say, and it's like the enrollment challenges, I think, are largely with agri-stability, not entirely, but largely with agri-stability, where the enrollment rates, have declined over years and flattened. And I mean, we'll have to see. We've made a number of important changes over the past couple of years, getting rid of the reference margin limit, the compensation rate increase. Like there's now the compensation rate increase, which will, provide more support for farmers who trigger. If we can come up with which I'm optimistic we can, with an approach that is simpler and more predictable for producers. I'm hopeful, right, that tackles some of those combination of policy changes will make the program more attractive, which ideally will bring more producers into agri-stability and give them that added protection, right?
Right. Okay. We look forward to the opportunity to engage on that important file over the coming year. I think this is a good segue to look at a handful of other issues that have been outlined in the minister's mandate letter. And I think that for many of us in Ottawa, we try and stay on top of the progress that many of these files are making, but some of our listeners might wonder where things are at with respect to a few of these. So I thought we could breeze through a few of these files. I'll start with the government's Green Agricultural Plan. The mandate letter outlines a commitment to increase support to farmers to develop and adopt management practices to reduce emissions, store carbon in healthy soil, and enhance resiliency, triple the funding for clean tech on farms, including for renewable energy, precision agriculture, and energy efficiency, as well as a commitment to work with farmers and stakeholders to reduce methane and fertilizer emissions in the agriculture sector. So I wondered if you could comment on some of the work that's happening in this space. And in particular, we talked about the National Fertilizer Emissions Reduction Target. Maybe talk a bit about that as well.
Sure. Thanks, Erin. So let me just walk through, some of the things that, because there's a lot that we've launched or in the course of launching to kind of respond to the mandate commitment, and some of it was funded in the last budget, and some of it comes out of the Sustainable Ag Partnership Agreement from Saskatoon. So, from the partnership, we will be launching, next year as part of the partnership under the FPT umbrella, a resilient agricultural landscape program, which is $250 million federal, provincial cost shared money, which is really, targeted at rewarding farmers for environmental stewardship practices, maintaining grasslands and wetlands, which we think can have a significant GHG emission reduction potential, and it will be, just given the nature of the environment across the country, it'll be provincially tailored and delivered, right? So it won't be recognizing that the circumstances in the prairies are different from Eastern Canada, or different from Ontario, et cetera. We're really trying to make sure it's tailored to each individual province's set of needs. On the federal sort of only side, we've launched and expanded on a couple of fairly big programs, and the total investment is over $1.5 billion. We've in the spring and summer launched the on-farm climate action fund, which there are projects across the country, supporting, as the title suggests, right? It's delivered by producer groups largely, or NGOs, to support practices and learnings around things like cover cropping and fertilizer management. I won't go through the list of projects, but there are plenty across the country, and many that would implicate or have benefit for some of your members. We've also launched and now tripled the Agriculture Clean Technology Program, which has both an R&D stream looking at how do we, develop longer term. You talked about the road to 2050, some of the bigger challenge pieces, like how do we move some of those needles, but also an adoption stream, which was focused initially on grain dryers, like how to get higher efficiency grain dryers, but for a range of on-farm, adoption of cleaner technologies, or cleaner technologies. And so that program has been very popular, and we're working on expanding that. We've also got the Living Labs under our Agricultural Climate Solutions, and these are projects where we're working on productive farms to work on issues like water management, soil conservation, soil health, projects in every province and across Canada. And this is really where it's not lab-based science, it's science in the field with farmers, solving problems that they identify, and that we can work with them to find economic solutions to. So we're excited about that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the clean fuel regulations in that, which I think should be relatively positively received. The final version, I know there's been a lot of work on that and a lot of back and forth with stakeholders, but I think we've landed in a pretty good place. So that's a long list, which hopefully is fairly comprehensive. I'll just turn to the fertilizer emissions reduction target, and maybe to start off and say, this was something was first announced in the fall/winter of 2020, and we had a number of engagements with stakeholders about how to do this. But the idea was a voluntary approach. We weren't looking at regulatory tools. We were looking at what were the best practices, the incentives, the tools out there to get us to a reduction target like that, as part of the recognition or the desire by the government to bring overall emissions down significantly by 2030, and fertilizer emissions being, in the ag sector, a significant part of the overall emission profile. The goal, to be clear, up front is not about compromising productivity or reducing production. And that's certainly why we wanted to look at voluntary approaches. It really was about, can we identify practices and technologies that producers can use to reduce emissions while still maintaining or increasing yield. We have these kind of twin challenges out there, the climate challenge and the food production challenge. And your road to 2050 obviously is tackling those challenges and opportunities, I guess, as well. And so I think the goal here was not ever to impose something, but was to work with stakeholders to come up with what's the best way we can get there collectively. We launched a consultation paper in the spring. It's obviously gained a fair bit of, I would say, additional profile in recent weeks. We have the consultation still open. We've had about 400 or more submissions to date. And we're certainly happy to take more. We do want to hear from people, and I just can't underscore enough, our approach is to get the feedback and certainly try to understand if there are, what are the tools people need, what are the technologies and practices people see as promising to get us there. We talk in the consultation paper about the 4R, Fertilizer Canada's 4Rs, and I think that in and of itself has significant potential and still a fair bit of room for further uptake if I base it on some of their surveys that I've seen on their website. So I think there's room to get there, but we obviously will have to look at the feedback we get in the paper and where we see gaps in the feedback we get from the consultation, look at where we see gaps that need to be addressed and how we might get there. And I, only then could I really tell you, is this going to, how close will we get? How hard will it be? Like, let's see what people say and let's see what some of the options are for getting us close to that target. But certainly no mandatory anything in that right now, right? I mean, it's certainly a discussion about how do we get there.
And that consultation is currently underway, closing, I think it's August 30th.
August 30th, yeah, end of the month. And we will certainly, engage after that. Like we'll publish some kind of report on what we heard and summarize that. And, I'll be completely frank, we'll hear I'm sure some supportive voices, and we'll hear some, questioning or critical voices, and we'll find, the balance between how we share that. Like we will make sure we get all those perspectives out in our what we heard report. I mean, we know some of the key questions will be around things like productivity, food production, the cost of, some practices may not be economical. Are there ways we can make them more economical? There may be technologies that are not yet available or not widely available, right? That need for a push or some incentive to get done. So we'll have to look at the combination of what we hear, and then we'll figure out and share with the sector. And certainly I expect further discussion on this. I don't think this issue is going to disappear, right?
No, and I think you're right in saying that it's really folks have been quite vocal since it was first announced 2 years ago, but more recently in the last few weeks. And I think, when you talk about it being voluntary, when you talk about the government being open to hearing directly from producers and coming to some sort of shared objectives, all of this sounds very good, but yet you see the pushback has really been quite significant. And there's a significant amount of concern, and I would say even a level of fear. And I wonder why you think that is. I wonder how much of that stems from, on one hand, we're being told that we have to look to increase overall production. You look in light of what's happening in the Ukraine, increasing overall production, and the impact that a reduction on overall fertilizer use could potentially have, because ultimately, if we're going to look to reduce emissions, we're probably going to have to look to reduce use of fertilizer. And a lot of farmers think about the cost. and using as only as much as they need to, and the practices they've employed on their operations over the years, and what impact this could have going forward. I just wonder if you want to comment on why we're seeing such significant pushback and concern, and maybe even ultimately fear from farmers across the country.
Well, I mean, I'm hesitant to speak about, why other people, I'm not in the shoes of the producers who are concerned, or the groups who have raised concerns. But I think what you've said hits it fairly directly from what I understand, which would be, obviously there's a strong concern about the idea that we're pushing a 30% reduction in fertilizer use, which means a 30% reduction in productivity or something of that. People see that concern, and I guess so there's a communication challenge. I think in some cases it's been reported or discussed as a ban, as a mandatory, that this is kind of a European style mandatory, which it is not. And so I think that, I presume, if I was in a producer's shoes, would raise some anxiety for me if I thought someone was going to come and force me to reduce my inputs by 30%, that without any kind of consultation or any options around that. I would be quite worried. So I think I take at face value that's where the anxiety comes from. And I guess my counter is, I think that there are some options with, I think, existing technologies and practices. And again, the 4R is an example where you see that there's room to increase uptake, which would have some benefits, some emissions benefits, right? Without affecting productivity. I do have some faith that our technology, our science, these are challenges we have to try to tackle, and they're not just Canadian challenges, they're global challenges, right? That we will find a way to do this. But I mean, that I can't prove the future to anyone, right? And that's part of what the consultations are about, is what are the opportunities? Are there options to do this? And can we find a way forward? But I mean, I hear the concerns about productivity, and that's, why I would start with. That's why certainly in this discussion, I want to be clear that this is a voluntary target. We're not mandating anything, and we're trying to engage with the sector to find out what the best way to get there would be.
And I appreciate that. Thank you. I wanted to give you an opportunity just to speak directly to some of what we're hearing from producers, so that you could comment directly on some of the concern and the fear that we're hearing, certainly from our members and publicly as well. I want to stay on the topic of inputs, and I want to ask you about the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, the PMRA, and their transformation agenda, as well as the related consultation that is currently underway. I believe the consultation date by which to make submissions has since closed, but the conversation continues, I think, with Health Canada. A proposed set of changes were put forward by Health Canada. I think it was a couple of years ago now, back in March of 2020. Those draft proposals were brought forward for consultation. And there seemed to be at the time a level of broad support, both within the agriculture industry, but I think also from other stakeholders, including the environmental NGOs, for the changes that were being proposed in that report a couple of years ago. You fast forward now 2 years later, and the government has suggested perhaps through the language that they're using, that these changes are not enough and that the agency must ultimately be transformed. So while I know you're not the Deputy Minister of Health, this does touch certainly on your portfolio, given farmers' dependence on crop protection products. So I'm wondering to what extent, Deputy, you can shed some light on what's happening internally that maybe led to the change in tone over the last 2 years, and then perhaps more importantly, once this process is complete, the impact that it could have on Canadian farms.
No, thanks, Erin. And this is I mentioned at the beginning that certainly regulatory questions and obviously pest management products are high on the list of tools that producers need access to be effective. And so I think this actually links quite closely to the discussion we were just having about food production, right? And I'm not the Deputy Minister of Health, as you said, so I can't speak for him and that department or what exactly will come out. But they will. They've taken a broader review, but they are in the process, much as kind of we discussed with the fertilizer consultation, of reviewing the comments they've received, via the consultation and from technical working group meetings, et cetera, that we and others have participated in. And we'll get a summary of what they've heard that will come out this fall that will kind of summarize the discussions. I think from my perspective, what we at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, try to do in these processes is make sure that the perspectives of producers are heard and understood. And I think, farmers, been loud and clear with us about the tools that they need access to. I mean, obviously these need to be assessed, via a credible science-based process. I think there's, universal agreement on that for reasons of health, safety, and obviously public trust. But certainly access to these products is really important for food production, right? And so we keep a fairly regular communication open with Health Canada, and we will throughout the process. And I think they've been fairly open with the sector in terms of engagement, and we will continue to push for that, recognizing that having a credible agency like PMRA, as part of the regulatory framework in Canada is one of the reasons why we can export our food all over the world, and people have faith in the Canadian system, right? That we produce safe, high quality food. So those discussions are ongoing, and how exactly they'll land, I couldn't tell you for sure, but we certainly will keep, and I know PMRA will keep ag stakeholders, closely involved in the discussions.
Super, thank you for that. You've been very generous with your time. I have two additional questions for you. I think that before my final question, I would certainly be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to ask you about Russia's war in the Ukraine and how this unfortunate situation may be informing the conversations that the Canadian government is having now about global food security, productivity, and trade. Can you comment on that?
I muted myself there for a moment, sorry. Yeah, look, I think that this has been a really, obviously a difficult 6-month period now, a little over 6 months, right? 6, 7 months. And some good news recently with, some of the ships being able to leave Odessa to move some larger quantities of Ukrainian grain out. That's good news on a bunch of levels, and hopefully that can continue. I think you've underscored, Erin, like the issues here are, it is a reminder of, food security challenges across the world, the importance of Canada as a safe, reliable supplier and a large supplier of food to global markets to feed people all around the world. I mean, this crisis, the last 6-7 months have really underscored that point, right? And I think probably raised a lot of awareness around the world, right, and in Canada about the role we can play. I think that's good, right? I mean, I think it's always good when I shouldn't say it's good. It's positive for the sector that more Canadians are thinking about the role the sector can play, not only in feeding Canadians, which it does, but also in providing global food security. So, I think that's a positive thing that people are more aware of the role the sector can play. We, was certainly in the department and in the government, thinking about ways to make sure that we can help in Ukraine with things like temporary grain storage and other tools that will help. We've provided additional funding to the global agricultural market information system, which provides information to countries about stocks and supplies of food and fertilizer. So certainly working on that, and also on making sure that production, and again, goes back to our previous discussions, right? That productivity, that yield, that we're doing what we can to support growing productivity and yield in the Canadian agriculture system. So that's a longer term challenge. That's not a this year challenge, but that's a longer term challenge. And I'll say, and we may come back to this, I don't know, but obviously one of the big issues that we'll want to keep an eye on this year will be the Canadian harvest. You mentioned at the start, it's underway in parts of the country and starting soon in others. And obviously the mix of, we're hoping for a good harvest, and then for, a smooth functioning of the transportation system to get products that are destined for export markets to those export markets, right, in a timely manner. So we'll certainly be keeping an eye on that going forward.
So while farmers are out in the field this fall, Parliament will return. I think it's on September 19th. Off the top, Deputy, you talked about what you see as being the sector's priorities based on the conversations that you've had with stakeholders over the last year. What I'd like to know is, from the minister's perspective, what do you think her top 2 or 3 priorities are going to be returning to this fall session?
Well, let me tell you, what I would think, Erin, as we go into the fall, as I mentioned, we'll always be kind of watching the harvest and the movement of products to port. And we're hopeful that will go smoothly, but obviously that's something that, we need to keep an eye on as the agriculture department federally. So that, I think, is an issue more broadly, that's part of probably a broader supply chain kind of, focus that I think the government and a lot of businesses have, right? How do we improve supply chains and deal with some of these challenges that we faced over the past couple of years? Our colleagues at Transport Canada have had a supply chain task force working, and we'll see what that comes up with. But I think that'll be something that we'll be keeping an eye on. On trade and market access, we obviously have a few trade negotiations going on externally. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. And obviously, market access, market development issues will always keep us busy. On labor, we haven't talked about labor, but we are working on an agricultural labor strategy, which was another part of the minister's mandate letter. I think that'll be something that we'll want to make progress on via consultations and discussions with the sector over the course of the fall. We've talked about environment and the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership, the new policy framework. There's a lot to do to make sure those processes are, signed and sealed and ready to launch next April. So the minister will and the department will be focusing on that. And we'd also discussed BRM, and I think there's the specifics that we talked about. I think there's a lot of work there to make sure that we deliver and keep a strong risk management set of programs, a suite of programs for producers, and make them better. And as you alluded to, make sure that they're the programs that farmers need, right, to give them the support they need when they need it.
Pretty tough these days to narrow it down to just 2 or 3.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't follow your instructions. I think that was a bit longer, eh?
There's so much going on, and I expect many of these things, the government has committed to having these conversations over the course of the next year. So it's going to be a very busy year. So I appreciate the opportunity very much, Deputy Minister Forbes, to sit down today and talk about what some of those files are that we'll be working on together. It was really a pleasure to host you on our show today.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Erin. I really appreciate it. And it was a good discussion, some tough questions. So I hope it was some good answers for you and your listeners.
Very insightful. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for listening to another episode of Fireside Chats with Erin. We will be back in a few weeks' time with another special guest. In the meantime, if you want to stay up to date on all things GGC, please follow us on Twitter @Grain Growers or on Instagram @Canada's Grain Growers. Until then.